I sat on the worn armchair in our living room, gazing at the faint stains on the carpet I'd promised myself I'd clean but never found the time. My hands were calloused from years of labor, my shoulders heavy from the weight of trying to provide. Despite the challenges, I was content, or at least I convinced myself I was. My wife, Veronica, never seemed to share that sentiment. She'd grown colder over the years, her sharp tongue chipping away at the man I once believed I was. My modest job as a site supervisor in construction didn't impress her or her circle of self-proclaimed elites. I often endured her condescending remarks about my lack of ambition, her sighs of disappointment when I handed her the modest paycheck that barely stretched across our expenses. Still, I loved her. I loved the woman I married, the one who used to laugh at my corny jokes and dream about a simple life together. That woman was long gone. The turning point came one crisp afternoon. I walked into the house to find it unusually quiet. Veronica wasn't home, but there was something off. Her perfume lingered too strongly in the air, and the absence of her usual cluttered handbag by the door made my stomach churn. I found out later that she had sold my car. My car. The one thing I took pride in, the one possession that symbolized my hard work and perseverance. She'd sold it, along with a small collection of jewelry I had saved for years, using the money to buy her boyfriend an expensive watch and a vacation I couldn't dream of affording. She didn't even bother hiding it. When I confronted her, her face was devoid of shame. "I need more than this, Alex," she said flatly, gesturing around our modest home as if it were a prison cell. "You'll never be enough for me." Her words felt like a dagger, but I stayed silent, absorbing the blow. "And one more thing," she added, her voice colder than ever. "I want a divorce." I stared at her, my heart pounding, yet my face betrayed nothing. Her audacity, her cruelty, none of it surprised me anymore. "When?" I asked quietly, my tone calm and detached. "What?" she replied, startled by my lack of reaction. "When do you want me to sign the papers?" Her confidence faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "As soon as possible." Without another word, she grabbed her purse and left the house. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of her betrayal settling in. But instead of anger, I felt an odd sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I saw Veronica for who she truly was. The love I had clung to wasn't real. It was a memory, an illusion I had built to excuse her cruelty. As I stood up and walked to the mirror, I caught my reflection. The tired eyes, the weathered skin. It was as if I were staring at a stranger. "No more," I whispered to myself. "This ends now." That night, as I lay in bed, my mind began to race. Veronica thought she had won, that she could break me and walk away with her new life intact. She had no idea who I was or what I was capable of. I didn't need her validation. I didn't need her pity. What I needed was a plan, a way to rebuild my life, piece by piece, until the man in the mirror was someone I could respect again. The morning after Veronica left, I woke up to an eerie silence. The usual chaos she brought into the house, her high-pitched demands, the incessant clatter of her heels on the floor, was absent. The quiet was a balm and a burden, reminding me that I was alone but free. I made myself a simple breakfast and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. My mind raced, not with thoughts of Veronica, but with what came next. She had walked out with the confidence of someone who thought she had broken me, but she hadn't. I returned to work that day, pouring myself into every task, no matter how small. The routine grounded me, but I knew that staying stagnant wasn't an option. If I wanted to rebuild, I needed to think bigger. That evening, I sat down with a notepad and a pen. I listed every skill I had, every contact I could leverage, and every opportunity one could create. Real estate had always intrigued me. There was something about taking something run down and turning it into something valuable that resonated with me. The problem was, I had no experience in the field. But what I did have was determination. I started small, spending hours after work reading about property investments and flipping homes. I joined online forums, soaking up knowledge from seasoned investors. My evenings were filled with research and planning, and slowly, the vision of what my life could be started to form. The first opportunity came a few weeks later. A colleague mentioned a property nearby that had been sitting vacant for months. It was a fixer-upper, the kind of place most people wouldn't touch, but I saw potential. I scraped together my savings and took the leap. The first step was terrifying, but the moment the keys were in my hand, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't experienced in years. The work was grueling. I spent nights and weekends fixing the place up, learning as I went. Every nail I hammered, every wall I painted. It all felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself. When I sold the property months later, the profit was modest, but it was enough to ignite a spark. I reinvested the money into another project and then another. With each success, my confidence grew. The man who had once been mocked for his modest means was slowly becoming a force to be reckoned with. As I worked, I started to notice changes in myself. The gym became a sanctuary, a place where I could channel my frustrations and emerge stronger. My clothes fit better, my posture straightened, and for the first time in years, I felt comfortable in my own skin. My circle of friends began to change as well. I distanced myself from anyone who reminded me of Veronica's toxicity, surrounding myself with people who inspired and supported me. One evening, as I sat in my newly renovated office, I looked around at what I had built. The walls were adorned with blueprints and plans for future projects, the desk cluttered with contracts and financial statements. I thought about Veronica, about the life I had shared with her. A part of me wanted to thank her, not for the pain she caused, but for the fire she ignited in me. If she hadn't walked out, I might never have discovered the strength I had to rebuild from the ground up. The months turned into a year, and my small portfolio grew. My name began circulating in real estate circles, and people who once dismissed me started to take notice. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was reinventing it. One night, I stood in the mirror and stared at my reflection. The tired, defeated man I had once been was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone resilient, determined, and unstoppable. "Here's to the rebuild," I said softly, raising a glass of whiskey to myself. As I took a sip, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't looking backward. The future was mine, and I was ready to claim it. By the time a year had passed since Veronica walked out, I'd gone from owning one modest fixer-upper to managing a small but growing real estate portfolio. Every late night, every dollar reinvested, and every calculated risk was paying off. The man who once scrimped and saved for his wife's approval was now building something that even my past self wouldn't have believed possible. But the moment that truly changed everything came unexpectedly, as these things often do. It started with a phone call from a client, a wealthy retiree looking to downsize and sell a sprawling estate. The property had been on the market for months, too large and dated for most buyers. But when I toured it, I didn't see the aging furniture or the faded wallpaper. I saw potential. "This place is a gold mine," I told myself as I walked through the expansive halls. It had charm, a history waiting to be revitalized. The asking price was steep, but I knew the return would be massive if I could play my cards right. I spent the next few days crunching numbers, reworking my finances, and speaking to investors I'd built relationships with during my real estate journey. When I presented my vision for the property, they didn't hesitate to back me. Closing the deal felt like a victory, but the real work was just beginning. Renovating the estate required an army of contractors, designers, and specialists. Managing the project became my life. I was on site every day, overseeing every detail, ensuring that my vision for the property came to life. Weeks turned into months, and the estate transformed before my eyes. It wasn't just a house, it was a masterpiece. The once abandoned rooms were now filled with light, the neglected gardens restored to their former glory. The day I listed the property, my phone didn't stop ringing. Offers poured in, each one higher than the last. By the time I signed the final contract, the profit was more than I had made in the entire first year of my real estate journey combined. That deal put me on the map. Suddenly, I wasn't just another investor. I was a force to be reckoned with in the industry. People started calling me the estate reviver, a title that both amused and motivated me. I reinvested the profits, expanding my portfolio and diversifying into commercial properties. Each success felt like a step further away from the man Veronica had belittled, the man she deemed not good enough. But it wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about proving to myself that I was capable of more than I had ever imagined. With success came new opportunities, and with new opportunities came a different kind of life. I no longer worried about every dollar spent or every risk taken. I traveled to scout properties, attended high-profile networking events, and finally allowed myself to enjoy the fruits of my labor. I bought a sleek new car, not to impress anyone, but because I could. I moved into a spacious penthouse overlooking the city, a far cry from the cramped home I once shared with Veronica. Despite the changes, I remained grounded. The lessons I'd learned during my struggles stayed with me, shaping the way I approached my work and my life. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below, I thought about how far I'd come. I didn't feel anger or bitterness toward Veronica anymore. If anything, I felt gratitude. Her betrayal had been the catalyst for my transformation. For years, I had measured my worth by her approval, by the standards she and her circle had set. But now, I realized that my worth was never tied to her or anyone else's opinion. I was building a life on my terms, one brick at a time. That night, I received an email from a real estate magazine requesting an interview. They wanted to feature me as one of the top 10 rising stars in real estate. I stared at the screen for a moment, the words sinking in. I wasn't the man Veronica left behind. I was someone new, someone unstoppable. Smiling to myself, I replied to the email with a single sentence. I'd be honored to share my story. The day started like any other, filled with meetings, site visits, and a constant buzz of activity that had become the rhythm of my new life. As the owner of a steadily growing real estate portfolio, I was busier than ever, but I relished the pace. Each project I touched, each deal I closed, reminded me of how far I'd come. That afternoon, I received an invitation to visit one of my recently acquired properties, a high-end restaurant in the city. It was one of those luxury spots where executives closed deals over champagne, where influencers posed for photos against marble backdrops. I hadn't been there since acquiring it, too occupied with other ventures. But today, something told me I should go. I arrived early evening, the golden glow of the setting sun reflecting off the restaurant's sleek glass facade. The valet greeted me warmly, and I stepped inside, taking in the understated elegance of the space. It was a far cry from the modest diners I used to frequent with Veronica. The manager, a sharp and attentive man named Richard, greeted me with a respectful nod. "Mr. Shaw, welcome," he said. "It's an honor to have you here. Can I show you to your table?" I waved him off with a polite smile. "No need. I'm just here to soak it in, get a feel for the place." As I wandered through the dining area, my eyes caught on a familiar figure seated near the back. The sound of her laughter reached me before her face registered. Veronica. She was seated at a corner table, a glass of wine in hand, her signature smirk plastered across her face. Opposite her was a man I didn't recognize, but the way he leaned in, hanging on her every word, made it clear he was her new conquest. For a moment, I felt a pang, not of jealousy, but of incredulity. Here she was, acting as if she hadn't left our life in shambles, as if her choices hadn't pushed me to rebuild everything from scratch. I considered leaving. There was no need to engage, no need to stir the waters. But something held me back. I wasn't the same man she walked out on. I chose a table far enough away to avoid notice, but close enough to observe. From my vantage point, I saw her flash the same smile she used to reserve for me, her gestures animated as she regaled her companion with stories. The bitterness that might have consumed me a year ago was absent. Instead, I felt detached, like watching a scene from a play I'd long since left. I ordered a drink, leaning back in my chair as I watched the dynamic between her and her companion. He seemed enthralled, oblivious to the shallowness beneath her charm. But then, fate decided to intervene. As I raised my glass, the movement caught her eye. Her laughter faltered, her gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, she froze, the confident facade slipping as recognition dawned. Her companion followed her gaze, turning to see what had rattled her. "Do you know him?" he asked, his voice curious but unconcerned. She quickly regained her composure. a forced smile curving her lips. "Just an old acquaintance," she replied dismissively. But I knew better. Our eyes met again, and I gave her a slight nod, an acknowledgement of the moment. She looked away quickly, her shoulders stiffening as she tried to regain her rhythm with her companion. I didn't approach her, didn't need to. My presence alone was enough. Richard appeared by my side, breaking the tension. "Is everything to your liking, Mr. Shaw?" "Perfect," I replied, a wry smile playing on my lips. "The place looks incredible." "Thank you, sir. Your vision has been a guiding force for us." His words struck a chord. This was my space, my creation, my success. Veronica had no power here. I finished my drink and rose to leave. As I passed Veronica's table, I felt her eyes on me, her unease palpable. I didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. Instead, I walked out of the restaurant with the quiet confidence of a man who no longer had anything to prove. Outside, the evening air was cool and refreshing. I leaned against my car for a moment, looking back at the glowing sign of the restaurant. The encounter had reminded me of something important. I had rebuilt my life not to impress or spite anyone, but for myself. Veronica and her world were relics of a past I had outgrown. As I drove away, a sense of peace settled over me. This wasn't the end of the story, just another chapter in the journey I had chosen to write. A week later, I found myself back at the restaurant, not for business this time, but simply to enjoy the atmosphere and let my mind unwind. The place was becoming a favorite of mine, not because I owned it, but because it symbolized everything I had worked for. The quiet strength, the elegance, the perseverance. As I entered, the staff greeted me with the warmth and respect I had come to appreciate. I nodded in return, content to keep a low profile for the evening. I was shown to a table near the window, where I could enjoy the view of the bustling city streets below. I had just taken a sip of my drink when I heard a voice I hadn't expected, or wanted, to hear. Well, look who decided to step up in the world." I turned slowly, finding myself face to face with Veronica. She stood there, dressed to the nines, her signature smirk plastered across her face. Beside her was the same man I had seen her with before. Her boyfriend, I assumed. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "I guess even you need a taste of the finer things every now and then." Her boyfriend chuckled, clearly feeding off her energy. "Is this your idea of treating yourself?" he added, glancing at my table. "A little out of your league, isn't it?" I felt the familiar pang of irritation, the old wounds of her contempt threatening to resurface. But instead of letting her words get to me, I simply leaned back in my chair and smiled. "Good to see you too, Veronica," I said calmly. She crossed her arms, her smirk widening as she took a step closer. "You know, Alex," she began, deliberately using the wrong name, "you really should stick to places more, your speed. This isn't the kind of place for someone like you." Her boyfriend laughed again, clearly entertained by her taunts. I met her gaze, unflinching. "And what kind of place would that be, Veronica?" She hesitated, caught off guard by my lack of reaction. But she quickly recovered, her confidence returning. "Somewhere more affordable. You know, where people won't notice if your shoes don't match the tablecloth." Her words might have stung in the past, but now they were nothing more than empty jabs. I had worked too hard, come too far, to let her pettiness affect me. I chuckled softly, the sound catching her off guard. "You're right," I said, setting my glass down. "I do prefer places where the people are as authentic as the food." The remark landed harder than I expected. Her smile faltered, her boyfriend shifting uncomfortably beside her. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped, her tone sharp. I shrugged. "Nothing at all. Just an observation." Before she could respond, Richard, the manager, approached our table. "Mr. Shaw," he said, addressing me with his usual professionalism, "everything to your liking this evening?" Veronica's expression shifted instantly, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "Mr. Shaw?" she repeated, glancing between me and Richard. I smiled up at the manager. "Perfect as always, Richard." "Thank you." He nodded and excused himself, leaving Veronica and her boyfriend staring at me in stunned silence. "What was that about?" her boyfriend asked, clearly trying to piece things together. Veronica, however, seemed to be putting the pieces together faster. Her face paled slightly, the realization beginning to dawn. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I suppose I should explain," I said, my tone calm but deliberate. "You see, Veronica, this isn't just a restaurant I enjoy. It's one I own." Her boyfriend's jaw dropped, but it was Veronica's reaction that truly satisfied me. Her smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "You own this place?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Among other things." The silence that followed was almost comical. Her boyfriend muttered something about needing a drink, leaving Veronica to grapple with the reality of the situation. For a moment, she looked as though she might say something, but instead, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. I watched her go, feeling no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet sense of closure. As I finished my meal and prepared to leave, Richard approached me once more. "Quite the scene back there," he said with a knowing smile. I chuckled. "Nothing I didn't expect." He nodded. "Well, it's always satisfying to see the tables turn." I smiled, handing him a generous tip. "Indeed it is." As I stepped out into the night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt truly free, not just from Veronica, but from the man I used to be. I returned to the restaurant the following week, this time with a specific purpose. The fallout from the last encounter had left me with more clarity than ever. I was no longer someone seeking validation or recognition. This was my space, my creation, and my life. And I was going to own it, in every sense of the word. As I stepped through the glass doors, the staff greeted me warmly. The energy in the restaurant felt different now, as though everyone had picked up on the unspoken shift in my confidence. Richard, ever the attentive manager, met me near the entrance. "Good evening, Mr. Shaw. Shall I prepare your usual table?" "Not tonight," I replied with a smile. "I'll need the private dining room. I have a special guest joining me shortly." Richard nodded, his expression curious but professional. "Right this way, sir." The private dining room was the crown jewel of the restaurant, reserved for VIPs and special occasions. It was elegant yet understated, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. I took my seat, savoring the quiet anticipation of what was to come. Minutes later, Richard returned, his expression unreadable. "Your guest has arrived," he said. I stood as the door opened, and there she was, Veronica. She hesitated in the doorway, clearly unsure of what to expect. Gone was the smug confidence she had displayed in our earlier encounters. Her posture was stiff, her expression wary. "Veronica," I greeted her calmly. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" she replied, her voice sharper than she probably intended. I gestured to the seat across from me. "Please sit." She moved cautiously, her eyes darting around the room. The luxury of the setting didn't escape her, and I could see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to piece everything together. "You said you wanted to talk," she said, her tone defensive. "So, talk." I leaned back in my chair, studying her for a moment. "I thought it was time we addressed a few things," I began. "The last time we saw each other, there were misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" she scoffed. "Is that what you call it?" I smiled faintly. "You always did have a flair for dramatics, Veronica." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. I continued, my tone measured. "For years, I let you define how I saw myself. I believed your words, your criticisms, your disdain. But I've realized something important. You were projecting your own insecurities onto me. And I allowed it." Her lips parted, but no words came out. I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "But I'm not that man anymore. The life I've built since you left, it's mine. Every success, every step forward, is because I decided to value myself, not seek validation from someone who never appreciated me." For the first time, Veronica looked genuinely uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, her usual sharp retorts nowhere to be found. "You've done well for yourself," she said finally, her voice quieter than I expected. "I have," I replied simply. She glanced out the window, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. So, what now? You brought me here to gloat? I shook my head. No, Veronica. I brought you here to close the chapter, to show you that I'm no longer tied to the man you tried to leave behind. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding, of unspoken truths finally coming to light. I made mistakes, she said eventually, her voice tinged with regret. I thought I was doing what was best for me. And you did, I said calmly. You made your choices, and I made mine. We're just living with the consequences now. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the table. I stood, signaling the end of the conversation. This restaurant, my business, my life, it's all a reflection of what I've built. And it's proof that I didn't need you to define my worth. Veronica looked up at me, her eyes glistening with something that might have been regret or realization. Goodbye, Veronica, I said, my voice steady. She didn't respond as I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit alone in the quiet elegance of the space I now owned. Outside, the city was alive with lights and energy. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The chapter with Veronica was truly over, and for the first time, I felt nothing but peace. I smiled to myself as I walked down the street, ready to embrace the next chapter of my life, one where I was in full control, free from the shadows of the past. The encounter with Veronica in the private dining room stayed with me for a few days, not because it hurt or unsettled me, but because it symbolized a turning point. Seeing her reduced to silence, her sharp edges dulled by the weight of her choices, was the closure I hadn't realized I needed. Her words, halting, tinged with regret, played in the background of my thoughts as I went about my days. But instead of triggering old wounds, they solidified something I had always suspected. Veronica had underestimated not just me, but the value of resilience. The realization struck me on a quiet evening in my penthouse. I had just finished reviewing plans for a new property acquisition when I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below, a reminder of how far I had come since the days of feeling small under Veronica's judgment. I thought back to the man I used to be, the man who worked tirelessly to earn her approval, who let her criticism shape how he saw himself. I had allowed her dismissive comments to erode my confidence, her mockery to dim my ambition. But now, I saw those years in a different light. Every sacrifice, every moment of humiliation, had built the foundation for the person I had become. Veronica's betrayal had been the catalyst, but my growth had been my own. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting the rich, smoky flavor linger as I reflected on the journey. There was no bitterness in my thoughts about her, no lingering anger. Instead, there was clarity, a sense of peace that came from knowing I had taken control of my life and reshaped it on my own terms. The next day, I had a meeting with a journalist from a prominent business magazine. They wanted to feature my rise in real estate, focusing on my unconventional journey from a modest start to owning a thriving portfolio. Sitting across from the journalist in my office, I found myself speaking candidly about the challenges I had faced. I wasn't always this confident, I admitted, leaning back in my chair. There was a time when I let someone else's opinion dictate how I saw myself. But that's the thing about self-worth. You have to find it within, not from someone else's validation. The journalist nodded, scribbling notes furiously. And what changed for you? What was the turning point? I paused, considering the question. It wasn't just one moment. It was a series of decisions. Choosing to invest in myself, to take risks, to stop waiting for someone else to believe in me. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. As the interview wrapped up, I realized how far I had come. Not just in my career, but in my perspective. The life I had built wasn't about proving Veronica or anyone else wrong. It was about proving myself right. That evening, I received a text message from an unknown number. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I'm sorry for everything. Veronica. I stared at the message for a moment before setting the phone down. I didn't feel the need to respond. The apology wasn't for me. It was for her. The next day, I visited one of my properties, a new development on the outskirts of the city. The site was bustling with activity, construction crews working tirelessly to bring my vision to life. As I walked through the site, watching the framework of the buildings take shape, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Each brick, each beam, was a testament to the strength I had found within myself. I stopped for a moment, looking out at the open expanse of land. The air was crisp, the sky a vibrant blue. This was my life now, filled with purpose, growth, and a quiet confidence that no one could take away. That night, as I sat on my balcony, the realization crystallized. My worth was never tied to Veronica's validation or anyone else's opinion. It was rooted in my ability to rise, to adapt, to rebuild. I raised my glass to the skyline, a silent toast to the journey that had brought me here. The fallout from Veronica's realization was inevitable. After the evening at my restaurant and her failed attempt to apologize via text, the consequences of her choices began to unfold in ways I had anticipated but hadn't given much thought to. It started with whispers, mutual acquaintances reaching out, sharing fragments of gossip about Veronica's unraveling life. Her perfect facade, once upheld by charm and a social network that admired her polished exterior, was starting to crumble. One of those calls came from an old friend, Marcus. He'd been part of our circle back when Veronica and I were married, but had distanced himself when things went south. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice tinged with equal parts amusement and disbelief. I leaned back in my chair, twirling a pin between my fingers. "Try me. She's burning bridges left and right," he said. "That boyfriend of hers? Gone. Walked out after finding out she doesn't have the access to wealth he thought she did." I couldn't help but let out a low chuckle. "Figures. That's not all," Marcus continued. "Word's getting around about how she treated you. People aren't looking at her the same way anymore." It wasn't surprising. Veronica's social standing had always been built on appearances. Without her curated image and the financial support she'd taken for granted, her relationships were bound to falter. I didn't feel vindictive pleasure in hearing this. If anything, I felt detached. Her downfall wasn't my victory. It was the natural consequence of her choices. As the days passed, more stories emerged. Veronica's attempt to rebuild her life with her boyfriend had failed spectacularly. He'd left her not just emotionally but financially drained. Their shared expenses had been shouldered mostly by her, and with her limited income, she was now struggling to keep up. Mutual acquaintances told me she had moved out of the apartment they once shared and was staying with a friend. "Remember Lisa?" Marcus had mentioned during another call. "She's staying with her, but it's not going well. Lisa's already complaining about her attitude." I thought back to the Veronica I once knew, the woman who had been confident, ambitious, and sharp-witted. But that confidence had turned to arrogance, and her ambition had shifted into selfishness. While I didn't relish her misfortune, I couldn't deny the sense of closure it brought me. For so long, I had felt like the lesser partner in our marriage, the one constantly trying to meet her impossible standards. Now, I saw clearly that her standards had been built on a fragile foundation. One evening, I received a call from Richard, my restaurant manager. "Mr. Shaw, you might find this interesting," he said. "Go on." "Veronica showed up at the restaurant today." That caught my attention. "Did she?" "Yes," Richard replied, his tone carefully neutral. "She asked to speak with you. When I told her you weren't available, she seemed unsettled. She left shortly after." I thanked Richard and ended the call, leaning back in my chair as I processed this new development. Veronica was grasping at straws, trying to find some semblance of stability in a life that had spiraled out of control. For a fleeting moment, I considered reaching out to her. But then I reminded myself that she was no longer my responsibility. The next day, as I walked through one of my newest properties, I found myself reflecting on the stark contrast between our lives now. While Veronica struggled to navigate the fallout of her choices, I was building something lasting, something no one could take from me. The property, a sleek and modern apartment complex, was nearing completion. Standing in the lobby, surrounded by the hum of construction and the scent of fresh paint, I felt a sense of pride that Veronica's disdain could never diminish. I knew the rumors would eventually fade, and Veronica would find a way to stabilize her life. But the lessons she had taught me, through her betrayal, her mockery, and her downfall would stay with me. As I left the site, the sunset casting a warm glow over the city, I realized that the fallout wasn't just hers. It was mine too, but in the best way possible. It had cleared the way for a new chapter, one free of the weight of the past. Months had passed since the last time I heard Veronica's name uttered in any meaningful context. The whirlwind of her downfall seemed to have subsided, leaving behind a faint echo of what once was. Meanwhile, my life had taken on a rhythm of its own, a peaceful, productive cadence that was as fulfilling as it was liberating. I had made significant strides in my business ventures. My real estate portfolio had grown steadily, each property a tangible reminder of how far I'd come. Every meeting, every handshake, every successful deal reinforced the strength and resilience I had rediscovered within myself. But despite my progress, Veronica's shadow occasionally lingered in the periphery of my life. Mutual acquaintances would occasionally bring her up, sharing snippets of her current struggles. "Did you hear?" Marcus mentioned over coffee one morning. "Veronica's been trying to get back into the social circles she once thrived in. It's not going well." I raised an eyebrow, more curious than concerned. "Not going well, how?" He shrugged. "Turns out people aren't as forgiving as she expected. Her ex-boyfriend's departure didn't help either. Word got around about why he left. Let's just say her reputation has taken a permanent hit." I nodded, digesting the information without much emotion. It wasn't surprising. Veronica's world had always been built on appearances, and once the cracks began to show, there was no hiding the flaws beneath. One day, as I reviewed plans for a new project, an unexpected email landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple: "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to open it. Curiosity eventually won. The message was brief, but the words carried weight. "Alex, I've had a lot of time to think about everything. I know I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I hope you're doing well. Veronica." I leaned back in my chair, letting the words sink in. There was no anger, no bitterness, no desire to respond. Instead, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. Her apology, while overdue, wasn't something I needed, but it confirmed what I already knew. I had moved on, and so had she, in her own way. A week later, I stood at the grand opening of my latest development. The complex was a mix of luxury apartments and retail spaces, a project I had poured my heart into. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by investors, partners, and even a few media outlets. As I gave my speech, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The struggles, the betrayal, the growth. It had all led to this moment. "This isn't just a building," I said, my voice steady. "It's a testament to resilience, to perseverance, to the power of starting over. Every setback is an opportunity to rebuild, and every challenge is a chance to grow." The applause that followed was more than just noise. It was validation. Not from others, but from myself. That evening, as I stood on the balcony of the penthouse suite, overlooking the city that had become my playground, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons Veronica had unknowingly taught me. Gratitude for the strength I had found within myself. And gratitude for the life I had built. One defined not by what I had lost, but by what I had gained. Occasionally, I'd wonder where Veronica was, what she was doing, if she had found peace in the aftermath of her choices. But those thoughts were fleeting, like clouds passing through an otherwise clear sky. I had learned to let go, not just of her, but of the pain, the resentment, the need for validation. The following morning, I received a text from Marcus. "Saw the opening coverage. You're killing it, man. Proud of you." I smiled, typing a quick reply before setting my phone aside. There was a time when I needed affirmation from others to feel worthy. Now, I understood that true worth came from within. As I sipped my coffee and planned my day, I felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation: contentment. The aftermath of my past was no longer a burden, but a stepping stone, a reminder of how far I had come and how much further I could go. A year after Veronica's apology email, I found myself in a completely different place, both physically and emotionally. The scars of the past had faded, leaving behind a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. The restaurant, my first major investment, was thriving. It had become a hotspot in the city, attracting patrons from all walks of life. My real estate ventures continued to flourish, and I was in the process of launching a new project, a community housing initiative aimed at providing affordable living options without compromising on quality. But more than my professional success, it was the peace I felt within that marked this new chapter. One sunny morning, I stood on the balcony of my newest penthouse, sipping coffee as I admired the view. The skyline stretched before me, a testament to the opportunities life had to offer when you chose to rebuild rather than dwell on the ruins. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Marcus, ever the supportive friend. "Big plans today?" his text read. I replied with a smile, "Just meeting some investors. Nothing major. Let's grab dinner soon." As I set the phone down, I thought about how much had changed. The Alex who once sought approval and validation was gone, replaced by someone who valued his own worth above all else. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the site of my latest development. The groundbreaking ceremony was modest but meaningful. Investors, architects, and community leaders had gathered to celebrate the start of a project that was close to my heart. As I addressed the crowd, I spoke from a place of genuine passion. "This isn't just about building homes," I said, my voice steady. "It's about building futures, creating spaces where people can thrive. My journey to this point hasn't been easy, but it's taught me the importance of resilience and the value of giving back." The applause that followed was humbling. It wasn't just about the project, it was about the journey that had brought me here. That evening, as I walked through the city streets, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The memories of the past no longer carried weight. They were simply lessons, reminders of how far I had come. I stopped by a small cafe for dinner, enjoying the solitude. The hum of conversation around me was comforting, a reminder that life moved on, always forward. As I paid the bill and prepared to leave, I noticed a familiar face entering the cafe. It was Veronica. She didn't see me at first, but when her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then, she gave a small, hesitant smile. I nodded politely before turning to leave. There was no need for words. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. Walking away, I felt no bitterness, no anger, just a quiet acceptance of the choices we had both made. The next morning, I woke up early and headed to a nearby park for a run. The crisp air filled my lungs as I moved through the winding paths, each step a reminder of the strength I had gained over the past few years. As I rounded a corner, I stopped to catch my breath, looking out at the city skyline. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the buildings, a symbol of new beginnings. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. The chapter with Veronica was closed, and I was free to write the next one without the weight of the past holding me back. As I walked back to my penthouse, I couldn't help but smile. The future was bright, and I was ready to embrace it, one step at a time.